Hello and welcome to Dialogue. China is stepping up its efforts to encourage childbirths with the third child policy written into the Population and Family Planning Law. What are the takeaways of the latest revised law and how will China implement its supportive measures for childbearing and parenting? Additionally, the government recently announced regulations barring off-campus tutoring for students on weekends and holidays. What does it mean for kids and their parents, as well as the education industry? To discuss these topics and more, I'm joined by Han Hua, president of the Beijing Belt and Road Cooperative Community, Professor Jovi Toker at the American Graduate School in Paris, Flora Liu, founder of Joyview Education, and Joseph Kim, our correspondent in Seoul. That's our topic. I'm Xu Qinduo. Well, Han Hua, I will start with you. With the abolition of social maintenance fees and other restrictive measures, the amendment highlights the implementation of the third child policy as well as supportive measures. So give us some background. How serious is the situation? People are basically talking about a looming demographic crisis in China.
Okay, thanks for having me. When we see the policies currently step by step and very quickly, people see this happening in a few months, we must look back to see several years ago, actually, when the second child policy was announced about 5 years ago. The preparation work has already been started as to loosening up the whole family planning policy in the long run. So starting from there, investigations, research works have already been started to conduct in addition to this population census work, when there are about 1 million people, volunteer as well as professionals, were started to prepare for the census research and the data to be collected more effectively to come up with a long-term policy towards China's family planning or the childbirth policy. So it is a several years at least, or maybe longer, preparation towards the finally coming up of the third child policy this year. And with regard to the effectiveness of this policy, as well as the supporting measures, I would like to mention that people who are willing to have the second or the third children, they may already have that. And this policy, in my opinion, is to encourage people, especially young couples, who are not having even one child or a long-term family plan, or even have one child but would like to have more. So this policy is targeting these kind of couples, young couples, in the long run. And also the supporting measures, in my opinion, needs to be more effective than the policy itself. We are waiting to see whether these policies can be implemented and executed through many government agencies, non-government agencies, as well as institutes, and all the social groups. There are joint efforts to support these measures to be executed more effectively, so that the third child policy can be fully implemented. And I'm happy to see that it is not only a policy, but it has already been put into a law. So that means that there is no irreversible policy towards this one. And the government, as well as the society, is very serious in conducting this policy, and as well as the law.
Obviously, it's a comprehensive approach, and also, the government can't stress the importance, more about the importance of such a policy. So, Professor Toker, obviously, China is not the only country which is dealing with this demographic challenge here. If you look at the developed nations, as well as some other Asian countries like South Korea, Japan, Thailand, and of course Germany and many other European countries, there is a similar challenge. So, what is the situation in France? What the government is doing, to deal with such a problem? Let's say.
Well, the situation in France is considered to be relatively positive. It is not satisfactory, but it is relatively positive in comparison to the other European nations, or more generally in comparison to other well-developed, industrialized countries. The fertility rate per woman in France is 188. I believe the rate in China, as the last census has shown, is only 1.3. But just in order to situate it, in Germany, for example, the rate is 1.57. In Italy, it's 1.29, even below the Chinese rate now. So all these countries had that kind of challenge and were trying to apply specific policies. Now, what we see over a very long period of time, several decades, is that the efficiency of demographic fertility, so-called policies, is limited. We see as a whole, it's true in France, it's true in Germany, it's true over other continents. When it comes to developed countries, it is sufficiently difficult to bring up the fertility rates. It's not as difficult as that to bring it down. And one more point which makes things even more complicated, both for planning and for observation, is that we see, once again, over a long period of time, that once a country succeeds in bringing down the number of births, then it's very difficult to change course and bring it up once again. So there are many mines, if I may say so, over the field of centralized demographic policies, and it would be extremely interesting to see which way would the figures speak in China once this new law is on its way.
Well, thank you, Professor Toker. Flora, if you look at the numbers, that's why obviously numbers somehow lead this anxiety of Chinese policymakers. For example, 2020, the year you see these new babies, 12 million of them. That's actually, a drop in the fourth consecutive year in terms of the newborns. And then, of course, fertility rate is 1.3, is lower than the internationally agreed sensitive line, we call it like a red line, 1.5. But the government is talking about these policies in different areas, taxation, schooling, etc., housing. It's not exactly clear yet what they are going to do. But as an individual, what do you expect? What kind of policies you think that will give you this incentive, give people the incentive, okay, I'm going to have a second child, I'm going to have a third child?
Thanks for asking me this question. So as a single woman, what would incentivize someone like me to have baby, I think will be longer maternity leave, and also more affordable school district houses. And I would say that I hope the whole society changes its perspective about women executives. That will actually incentivize me to return to family and have babies. So right now the situation is very severe. I mean, the birth rate and fertility rate is very low. I think it has less to do with the family planning policy, but more to do with other childbearing pressure, just like I mentioned, that the price of real estate, the cost of educating children. So if all of this problem gets solved and women get more bonus for having children, more subsidies, and longer maternity leave, I think people will give it a try.
Mm-hmm. Oh, Joseph, let me bring you in here. You're located in Seoul. We understand there's a similar situation in South Korea. The low birth rate, even marriage rate probably is also low. And so what is the government doing to tackle such a challenge?
Well, the government has been trying to do many things to try to reverse its low fertility rate. We saw for the first time this year that South Korea had its birth rate drop below 1, which is very bad news for the government, which is trying to sustain a certain population. And even in 2020, South Korea saw more more deaths than births. Deaths outnumbering births. So this is actually a very intricate problem that South Korea is having to deal with, even though the government has tried to do various different things, including maternity leave and guaranteeing job security. Those things haven't actually translated into society, and I think that is actually one caveat that we need to constantly remember, that policy does not always translate into social settings, especially here in South Korea. Even though there are those laws, there are many instances where women have reported that even though they are protected by law to be able to keep their jobs after getting married and having children, there's still these social pressures within these companies saying that if you have children, that they will become a burden and they will no longer be able to work in these companies. So there is a big social aspect that we need to look at in South Korea, and whether these policies that South Korea has been putting forward is actually translating into society and incentivizing women to say, hey, you should have, that they should actually get married and have children.
Is it because the policy somehow is not strong enough, so it's not motivating enough? So let's say, childbearing age women in South Korea still refuse. They say, no, you know what? I don't have the interest despite all the policies. Joseph?
Well, I think the policies sometimes don't necessarily reflect what the society is saying, and incidentally enough, I think sometimes those policies, even though they are said, there isn't actually strong social movement and strong political movement to actually back those policies, which is the problem that we have on hand, especially in South Korea. As we heard from the colleague saying that if there were more women executives, that would incentivize women to have more children. But if we look at South Korea still has very large gender disparities. South Korea has the largest pay discrepancy between men and women, the average pay discrepancy between men and women among advanced economies. If we look at other factors such as paternity leave, how many men are actually taking time off to take care of children, child rearing, how much time men are spending in comparison to women to have to raise their children. All of these factors, if we look at them, even though there are laws in place and policies in place to help women to try to get along as mothers, we see that these are not translating into real settings because the society hasn't adopted the policies.
Mm-hmm. Well, Hanwha, obviously, Chinese cities in the different regions, they are adopting different policies to incentivize, to motivate women to have more children. For example, in the city of Panzhihua, basically 500 yuan cash handouts will be given to the second child and the third child each month until he or she turns 3. And like the city of Beijing is talking about having a longer extra period of time of this maternity leave, or even the father could leave if their firms agree to that. How strong, how powerful those policies are? Do you think people will somehow change their idea from being hesitant to, you know what, I will catch this chance and have another child?
Not necessarily. The policies, these single policies certainly sounds good, but not great. And I think if these policies can be combined together, and it will certainly have more incentives. For the cash alone, it's not enough in terms of the cash itself, the amount, the scale. And for the other policies like those in Beijing or in some other cities, I don't think these single policies are good enough. What is a policy? Policy is not a forecast. I would like it to call policies more like a summary of the previous practices, and it can have more effect in the long term. So the third child policy is just a start. We definitely need joint efforts and joint wisdom to come up with a collective policies rather than single policies here and there. So when it regards to this kind of incentives, I think both physical and mental policy, quote unquote, need to be motivated and need to be come up with, such as the housing prices, as Flora mentioned, and the double reduction in education, the burden of parents and children, or even teachers, and such as the taxation policies and the cash incentives. Also, the job and employment opportunities, as well as the time for maternity leave. I think it's more like a structure project that needs to get more government agencies, more institutions involved in this coming up of the policy process, so that these policies can reflect the willingness of people, not only the couples who are in their stage of willing to have more children in one family, but also the other family members like the grandparents who are willing to help their children, especially in this Asian culture, and the school teachers and the other agencies who are willing to accept more children for their capacity. So it's a collective work.
So Flora, after listening to Hanhua and also Joseph, in particular in the South Korea situation, say there's a gender equality, pay inequality, etc. People agree basically there's a need of a comprehensive set of policies. It's not about only one policy like 500 yuan a month or maternity leave alone. I guess you agree with that, but how? Imagine that in companies, you are the founder of your company. You say, okay, like I don't know how many young women just get married, or they're planning to be a young mom. Can the company afford to have give them a long-term, longer period of maternity leave and etc. Support not only from the government policies but also from the business point of view?
Thank you so much for asking me this question. So I actually want to point out the pressure on private companies like Joyview is very high if we hire a lot of female employees. But as a woman myself, I am happy, more than happy actually, to hire females, especially moms, because they're more empathetic and more caring, which are the core qualities in the education sector. So I would suggest that for private companies like Joyview, if we could have more subsidies from the government or even tax credits, we will be more incentivized, to hire female employees. Another idea to increase the fertility rate is actually to consider egg freezing technology and IVF. Sorry. Right now in China, egg freezing for single women is not allowed. It's not legal. But think about this. Right now, the gap between male and female is huge in China. A lot of well-educated women are not willing to step into marriage and are not have the right to give babies if they're single. So if we actually open up this policy and make women over 35, single women over 35, the right to use IVF and freeze their eggs, I think the fertility rate will increase as a result.
Back to Hanhua, you mentioned about the double reduction. This is a very China-specific policy. Basically, it refers to the government is issuing a set of guidelines to reduce excessive homework as well as off-campus tutoring for students, basically who are receiving this free education 9 years from the government, the country. But somehow parents will have a new arrangement for them to have extra curriculum activities, including the tutoring over there. Children will be happy with that, right?
Well, not necessarily. I think children's happiness is closely related to the parents' happiness or anxiety, especially in China. So with such a background and even the long history, tradition, or the Confucius heritage, I think not only in China but in Asian countries, people are attaching great importance to education. Family education, school education, schooling, or some extra curriculum, extending to this subject tutoring after schools. So this is like a very long history. And in the recent years, in the recent decades, because of these highly competitive job markets and also the migration environment, there are already like over 300 million migration workers in China, according to the recent population census. So these pressure and the competitiveness are coming from everywhere. So it all narrows down to the education for the children from day one when they are in the school. So if the I think the double reduction policy in education is also just a start. And the people now, families and friends around me, in the first place, they are concerned about the competitiveness of their children after 9 years of compulsory schools. And they even joked about that if we don't have private tutoring, then my children would end up with no high schooling after 9 years. So how to reduce this kind of anxiety by providing a variety of education and extracurricular courses from the schools, from the education departments is very crucial at this moment to ease the concerns, ease the anxiety for the parents, and at the same time to nourish a kind of balanced education, including not only limited to sports, to extracurricular, as well as the subject competitiveness. I think it's very important. Now I think people in the education industry are coming up with some alternatives, some very useful suggestions and to the government, and I believe, I'm positive actually, I think there will be a lot of detailed policies and the regulations following this general double reduction policy.
Mm-hmm. Well, Flora, obviously you are from the private education sector, which is let's say, severely affected by the government policy over there. And, at the same time, people would say, there's a balance, why the government is taking such an action against this sector, partly because at least some of the institutions, some of the services, for example, they are basically repeating all, actual, say, time and energy being spent on the core school subjects instead of finishing the subjects inside the school, but somehow they're being done outside the school. And I know there are, criticism, there are different opinions with the government policies, but what's the sentiment now? Do people tend to say, we needed to have a balance between homework, between extracurriculum training, but at the same time, the well-being of the children?
Let me share with you a personal story. Last Saturday, I was invited to my cousin's place to have lunch with her family. And during lunch, my cousin expressed her huge concerns over the double reduction policy. The reason being her son will go to the preschool this year, but she hasn't been able to find a great English tutor yet because of the policy. So she asked me, Flora, can you teach my son for free? So you can imagine the lunch was very delicious that day. The point being, that the supply is cut, but the demand still exists. If we do not change the high school entrance examination system, if we do not change the college entrance examination system, the problem will still be there. But double deduction policy is a good start, we have to admit. And as a part of the education industry, Joyview was luckily not impacted by the policy, because from day one, we decided we would never offer after-school tutoring because this industry is overheated, and it's not helpful to feed off parents' anxiety while ramping up pressure on children to drive business. What really helps is to offer comprehensive education to students, to develop compassionate young leaders who would eventually impact our world. That's why we never touch the off-campus tutoring. So I would say double reduction is a good start, but in the long term, to solve the problem, what we really need to do is to inform the education system, is to invest heavily on public education.
Mm-hmm. Joseph, I have to go to you here. We know that in South Korea, the situation probably is the same as in China, if not worse. As our two other guests mentioned about, as long as there's, the competition, even sometimes it's unbalanced, like educational resources. And parents will say the demand is always there. Whatever the government policy, we have the demand. So what can you do it, and what South Korea is doing to somehow reduce, parents' anxiety in terms of competitiveness?
Yeah, those are great points, because if we do look at the South Korean market, in the 80s, we saw that there was actually a ban on tutoring. They couldn't tutor, or they couldn't have private tutoring after the semester or school year started, so during holidays or whatnot. And they couldn't tutor unless they had certain certificates. But all of this actually didn't really matter much, because people had the demand and people were still continuing to get private education. And now we see South Korea having one of the, seeing its private education sector being worth billions of dollars. A lot of these companies who are private education companies, they even go public, and their IPOs are worth a lot of money. So we see that the demand is high, but the environment that creates this and continues to do it is, as was already mentioned, is the test that high school students have to take, and the competitiveness to get into these good schools, and how these resources are spread out. Even though the government was trying to make it so that the demand diminished, we saw that the demand continued to rise, and in South Korea that created an environment where even till today, South Korean children and school children have so much pressure on them that the highest reason, the number one reason for suicides at that school year age is because of social pressures in terms of education and what their future are going to be.
Professor Toker, I understand the situation in European countries in terms of this, excessive homework or extracurriculum tutoring services over there is a bit different from, let's say, Asian countries like China and South Korea, Singapore. So what the situation is like there, and don't parents also somehow worried about their performance, academic performance of their kids?
Oh yeah, I don't know whether there could be established sort of a chart in which we can compare the level of anxiety of parents in different countries, in different cultures. It would be a very hazardous sort of so-called scientific domain. But of course, school is related to all that. I would say that from a European perspective, the major problem regarding the overall schooling system, public schooling system, is not really its correlation to demographic concerns, namely, would that bring up ambitions of young or less young couples to have more children or not, but the overall level, the overall standards of the public school system. And that's the major problem in France. That's the major problem practically in all big European countries, with the exception of the northern Scandinavian ones. And one more element I think that we should add in order to have a larger perspective worldwide is that one of the most successful ways to heal demographic problems is, of course, immigration. This is why French status in Europe right now is much better than its neighbors, because there has been over the last 30, 40 years a relatively substantial number of immigrants coming. This is why probably Chancellor Merkel of Germany decided 5-6 years ago to let over 1 million refugees from the Middle East and Western Asia enter Germany into a path which would make them German citizens, because she was aware of the alarming demographic figures in data in Germany. So this brings us, of course, to a completely different set of considerations.
But there are also different policies to meet these challenges. Okay, many thanks to Professor Toker, Joseph, Hanhua, and Flora. And also thank you for watching. And this is the end of our show. See you next time.